The humid air of the Philippine archipelago hung heavy with the scent of salt and rust. It was the summer of 1945. Inside a makeshift compound near Manila, the cries of cicadas mixed with the distant hum of American trucks. Behind the barbed wire, a group of exhausted women, former nurses, clerks, and communication aides of the Imperial Japanese Army, waited silently. Their uniforms, once symbols of imperial duty, were now faded scraps. They had been captured months earlier after Japan's surrender in the Pacific. Fear lingered in every heartbeat. Rumors had spread among them that the Americans would exact revenge, that they would be punished for the cruelty their own soldiers had inflicted across Asia. No one knew what awaited them. Then, one morning, as the guards approached, they noticed something odd in the soldiers' hands. Small envelopes, neatly addressed, each bearing a name written in careful script. When the first woman opened hers, she froze. Inside was a simple card, decorated with stars and stripes. It read, "Happy birthday." The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was something deeper, something that would redefine their understanding of war and humanity. And to understand how such a moment became possible, we must go back years before that morning. Long before the women behind the barbed wire received those cards, the world had already been consumed by fire. The 1930s had transformed Japan from an island nation into an empire driven by divine ambition. The doctrine of Hakko Ichiu, the 8 corners of the world under one roof, fueled the belief that the emperor's destiny was to lead Asia. Schools taught it. Newspapers echoed it. Young women were raised on it. Many of them volunteered as nurses, clerks, or typists for the Imperial Army, seeing service not as duty alone, but as devotion to the emperor himself. When war erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, Japan's victories came swift and stunning. Manila, Singapore, Hong Kong, all fell under the rising sun. The empire's expansion seemed unstoppable, and with it came an unshakable confidence that Japan's spirit was invincible. But behind that confidence lay an unspoken code. Surrender was dishonor. To be captured alive was to bring shame upon one's family, upon one's ancestors, upon Japan itself. That belief would shape everything to come. For Japanese soldiers, and even for the women who followed them into war, captivity was unthinkable. They would rather die. On the other side of the Pacific, America was preparing for a different kind of war. A war not of spirit, but of logistics and industry. The United States saw itself as a nation fighting for order in a world gone mad. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, the emotional shock galvanized an entire generation. Factories roared to life. Ships rolled off the docks at record speed. And with them came a flood of young men, farmers, students, and clerks, turned soldiers almost overnight. As the conflict deepened, both nations began to see the other as less than human. Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as barbaric and soulless. American posters depicted Japanese soldiers as cunning beasts with sharp teeth and yellowed eyes. Hatred became easy to manufacture, and empathy was quietly erased from the battlefield. Yet the war would eventually force both sides into contact, far beyond the front lines. As the U.S. advanced through the Pacific Islands, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, they encountered something they had not anticipated. Women among the captured. Not combatants, but auxiliaries. Nurses, clerks, sometimes even civilians, caught between retreating Japanese forces and advancing American troops. Many of these women had been trained to believe they would be executed on capture. They expected cruelty, violation, or death. But by 1944, the U.S. military had established clear guidelines for handling prisoners of war, rooted in the 1929 Geneva Convention. Japan had never ratified it. To the Japanese mind, that convention was a Western construct, alien, unnecessary, even dangerous to discipline. American officers, however, were bound by it, at least in principle. Prisoners, whether male or female, were to be fed, sheltered, and protected from abuse. This difference in philosophy would soon become one of the most defining contrasts of the Pacific War. In Japanese captivity, Allied prisoners, especially in places like the Burma Railway, Bataan, and Java, faced starvation, beatings, and executions. To the Japanese command, this was not cruelty but control. It was a reflection of their belief that surrender equaled moral weakness. Discipline through suffering was seen as correction. But when the roles reversed and Japanese soldiers began to fall into American hands, the situation shifted dramatically. In American-run camps, conditions were far from perfect, but they were structured. Food rations were limited but steady. Medical care was provided when possible. Letters were sometimes permitted. And in the final months of the war, as Japanese surrender became inevitable, American officers faced an unexpected question. What to do with female prisoners, especially those who had served the enemy faithfully, yet were now powerless, frightened, and ashamed? By early 1945, the answer was still unclear. Most of the captured Japanese personnel were men, and even those numbers strained resources. But in the Philippines, after Japan's fall, a unique category of prisoners emerged. Women from the Imperial Japanese Army Nursing Corps. Many had served in field hospitals, treating wounded soldiers during the Bataan campaign and later in Luzon. Some had seen the atrocities committed against civilians. Others had simply followed orders. When they were captured, they expected execution. Instead, they were placed in a temporary POW camp near Santo Tomas University in Manila. It was an unusual sight. The camp, once holding American civilians imprisoned by the Japanese, now housed their former captors. Roles had reversed almost overnight. The American officers in charge were young, most in their 20s. They had seen death on the beaches, in the jungles, in burned-out towns. But they were also men raised on ideals of fairness and order, drilled to obey the conventions of war. The female Japanese prisoners, in turn, looked at them with a mix of fear and disbelief. Every act of civility was met with suspicion. When food was served, they bowed nervously, waiting for a blow that never came. When allowed to rest, they whispered prayers, certain that this kindness was a trick before punishment. For the Americans, their presence posed a moral dilemma. How do you treat those who once represented an army that had killed your comrades? How do you see humanity in faces you were taught to hate? And so, amid the chaos of post-surrender Manila, an unspoken experiment began, a quiet test of the American conscience. The war was technically over, but in these small camps, its moral reckoning had just begun. Day by day, the prisoners began to notice things. The guards spoke to them without shouting. Food portions were fair. When illness struck, a U.S. Army medic, a woman named Lieutenant Eleanor Carter, visited the infirmary. She did not scold them or curse them. She simply asked about their symptoms, checked temperatures, handed out medicine. To the Japanese nurses, it was inconceivable. Compassion from an enemy was a concept that did not fit into their world. In their eyes, America had destroyed their homeland. Yet here was an American soldier, gently tending to them. In that fragile space, the first seeds of a remarkable transformation were sown. As autumn gave way to winter in 1945, American administrative officers decided to document every prisoner, names, dates of birth, former rank, and service history. It was routine paperwork, but it would lead to something extraordinary. Among those lists, a young clerk noticed several upcoming birthdays. Without instruction, he and a few others in his unit took it upon themselves to write simple birthday cards. Nothing elaborate, just gestures of acknowledgement. They signed them with names, sometimes even small notes. Wishing you peace in the days ahead. No one expected the reaction that followed. And to understand why that act of kindness struck so deeply, we must first look at the world that shaped these women, the Japan they left behind, and the beliefs they carried with them across the Pacific. The Japan of the early 20th century was a nation balanced between two worlds, an ancient empire built on feudal discipline, and a modern state rapidly industrializing under Western influence. By the 1930s, the Meiji reforms had transformed its economy, its military, and even its education system. Yet beneath the machinery of modernization, Japan's heart still beat to the rhythm of Bushidō, the way of the warrior. Honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice were not merely virtues, they were life's purpose. From an early age, children were taught that the emperor was not a ruler by politics, but by divinity. To die for him was the highest expression of devotion. Textbooks describe Japan's wars not as conflicts, but as holy missions of liberation, bringing Asian unity under Japanese guidance. For boys, this meant preparing to fight. For girls, it meant preparing to serve. When war spread through China and into the Pacific, thousands of Japanese women stepped forward to join auxiliary services. They became nurses, stenographers, typists, and communications aides. They patched wounds, recorded reports, cleaned blood-soaked uniforms, and prayed over dying men who whispered the emperor's name with their last breath. To them, their work was sacred. But this devotion came with blindness. Few questioned the brutality inflicted by their own army, massacres, forced labor, or the treatment of Allied POWs. Propaganda painted Japan's enemies as subhuman, their suffering as deserved. In cities across Japan, posters urged women to endure for victory. They rationed food, donated metal, and sent sons and brothers to die without hesitation. The war became total, not just in weapons, but in spirit, and that spirit would shatter only in 1945. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the emperor's voice trembled across the radio, announcing surrender. A silence unlike any before settled over Japan. For the first time in history, the divine had spoken words of defeat. Many refused to believe it. Others wept openly. In distant outposts, from China to the Philippines, Japanese units were cut off, uncertain whether to surrender or fight on. For the women stationed in these regions, the news carried a more personal terror. To surrender was to betray everything they had been taught. It meant shame. It meant they could never return home. Even after the emperor's order, many female nurses and aides contemplated suicide. Some carried cyanide tablets, others sharpened surgical scalpels, ready to end their lives rather than be captured. Those who survived did so not out of courage, but out of exhaustion. Hunger, disease, and chaos left them too weak to die. When American patrols reached their camps, they found the women emaciated, terrified, and silent. Their faces betrayed not defiance, but confusion. They did not resist. They simply bowed, eyes lowered, waiting for punishment. For the first time in their lives, they were powerless. To the Americans, this moment was equally jarring. These were the people whose empire had bombed Pearl Harbor, whose soldiers had killed and tortured their comrades in the jungles of Bataan and Burma. Yet here they were, frail, starving, human. The war had turned monsters back into people. In the months that followed, American forces across the Pacific found themselves running not only military operations, but humanitarian ones. They had to feed, shelter, and repatriate millions of former Japanese soldiers and civilians. The Allied command set up temporary camps to process them, some in Okinawa, others in the Philippines, and later in Japan itself. These camps were places of strange contradiction, guarded by men who had fought for years to destroy Japan, yet now bound to protect its defeated sons and daughters. At the Santo Tomas compound in Manila, the female prisoners were placed under the supervision of the U.S. Sixth Army. The camp itself was a ghost of war's irony. Once a college, then a Japanese internment camp for Americans, now a prison for Japanese. The walls still bore marks of old bullet holes. The courtyards were silent except for the shuffle of boots and the distant cries of children in nearby streets. Life inside was strictly controlled. Prisoners rose at dawn, cleaned their quarters, and lined up for rations of rice and canned meat. Medical checks were frequent. Disease and malnutrition had already taken a toll. The Americans, though cautious, allowed basic comforts: clean water, limited reading materials, and even the occasional letter to home through the Red Cross. Yet even in these improved conditions, the psychological walls remained high. The Japanese women rarely spoke to their guards. When addressed, they answered softly, eyes lowered. When thanked, they bowed too deeply, unsure if politeness could erase guilt. To them, captivity was not freedom. It was purgatory. Meanwhile, among the American personnel, curiosity grew. They had fought a war against an enemy painted as fanatical and merciless. But here they saw something else: discipline, pride, and shame interwoven into fragile silence. One officer described in his diary, "They never look us in the eye. They obey every order instantly, but you can see they don't understand mercy. It frightens them more than punishment would." This cultural gap was profound. For Americans, mercy was a moral victory. For the Japanese, mercy from an enemy felt like humiliation, a reminder of failure. Each gesture of kindness reopened wounds of pride. But over time, necessity forced small cracks in that wall. When an epidemic of dysentery spread through the camp, American and Japanese nurses were made to work side by side. Language was a barrier, but the language of medicine transcended it. Gauze, water, morphine. Each became a shared vocabulary of survival. It was in these quiet exchanges that the first signs of mutual recognition appeared. Lieutenant Carter, the American nurse assigned to oversee the infirmary, later recalled that the Japanese women worked tirelessly, even refusing rest until the patient stabilized. They never complained. She wrote in a report, "They remind me of our own nurses in the Pacific. The same discipline, the same exhaustion, only their eyes are heavier, like they're carrying ghosts." By the end of 1945, the war's physical battles were over, but its psychological ones were not. The Japanese prisoners began to learn English phrases, sometimes writing them secretly in small notebooks. The Americans, in turn, grew less formal. Guards offered cigarettes, shared newspapers, even taught baseball to the younger internees. These were small gestures, but they carried immense symbolic weight. Then came December. The Americans compiled personal data for repatriation lists, including birthdays. When an officer noticed that one of the Japanese nurses, a woman named Sato Midori, would turn 23 on December 14th, he mentioned it casually in the mess tent. Someone joked about throwing a party. Another suggested writing a card. What began as a light-hearted remark became an act of quiet defiance. Defiance not against orders, but against the bitterness of war itself. A few soldiers used leftover stationery from Red Cross supplies. They drew small flags, wrote simple notes in careful handwriting, and tucked each into envelopes. There were no signatures of rank, no flags of victory, only names. When the cards were handed out days later, the reaction stunned even the hardened veterans. Some of the Japanese women burst into tears. Others stared in disbelief. A few refused to accept the cards, bowing and stepping back, as if the gesture were too generous to be real. In that fragile moment, the war's boundaries cracked. For those women who had expected death or disgrace, a simple birthday greeting from the enemy became something unfathomable, an acknowledgement of their existence beyond uniform, beyond nationality. And for the Americans who gave them, it was a reminder that compassion could survive even amid the ruins of hatred. What neither side realized then was that this small act would ripple far beyond that camp, shaping how future generations remembered the Pacific War, not merely as a clash of armies, but as a struggle for the soul of humanity itself. And it is from this fragile bridge between fear and understanding that the deeper human angles of this story emerge. The human angle of this story begins in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows the end of everything one believes in. For the Japanese women confined behind wire in the ruins of Manila, time itself felt suspended. Days blurred into weeks, marked only by the changing light over the courtyard and the mechanical rhythm of inspections. Among them was Nurse Sato Midori, the young woman who would later receive that first birthday card. She had joined the Imperial Army nursing corps at 19, fresh from her training in Osaka. She had been taught that a nurse's duty was not merely to heal the wounded, but to serve the emperor's soldiers until her own death if necessary. When she left Japan in 1943, her mother placed a folded paper crane in her bag and whispered, "Return only if victorious." Those words haunted her long after the empire's fall. In the months after her capture, Midori barely spoke. She ate little, slept less, and spent her nights staring at the horizon beyond the fence. She was not mourning Japan's defeat. She was mourning the death of the identity that had defined her. To be a Japanese woman in captivity was to be stripped not just of uniform, but of purpose. When the Americans treated her wounds and offered her clean bandages, she felt a kind of humiliation she could not name. Each gesture of kindness was unbearable, as if mercy were a weapon more painful than hate. And yet, slowly, something began to shift. She saw that the Americans spoke openly, even joked among themselves. Their laughter was not cruel, but ordinary. For the first time in years, she heard the sound of men unburdened by ideology. It frightened her and fascinated her. The human thread of this story lies in such moments, when the machinery of war gives way to glimpses of humanity. Each card, each meal shared, became a quiet rebellion against the dehumanization both sides had lived by. The prisoners and their guards were no longer symbols of nations. They were simply people trapped by history. But the human story cannot be separated from the tactical one. Behind every act of mercy lay paperwork, protocols, and the constant shadow of military regulation. The U.S. Army's handling of Japanese prisoners in the Philippines was not merely an act of compassion. It was a strategic choice shaped by policy, logistics, and propaganda. In the aftermath of the war, America sought to present itself not only as the victor, but as a civilizing force. With Europe in ruins and Asia scarred by atrocities, Washington understood that the world was watching. Treatment of prisoners became part of the image of post-war leadership. The Geneva Convention, though imperfectly followed, offered moral leverage in the early years of occupation. To show mercy was to show superiority, not of race, but of principle. In that sense, every birthday card, every medical inspection, every small courtesy extended to Japanese prisoners served a dual purpose. It reaffirmed American values, both to the outside world and to the soldiers themselves, many of whom were struggling with trauma and moral exhaustion. The cards were not policy, but they were perfectly aligned with what the U.S. Army hoped to represent: control through humanity. Inside the camp, however, the chain of command was clear. No soldier was to fraternize with prisoners. Contact was to remain formal, procedural. The cards broke that line, even if only slightly. They were not an official gesture. They were human impulse breaking through bureaucratic order. In the reports that followed, no disciplinary action was taken, perhaps because superiors understood their significance. The war had already inflicted too much cruelty. Small kindnesses, though unofficial, were quietly permitted. And yet, there was another layer, a cultural dimension that magnified the emotional impact of this exchange, far beyond what any American could have imagined. To a Western mind, a birthday was a simple occasion, a date marked each year to celebrate life. To a Japanese mind, especially within the wartime context, it carried no such weight. Birthdays were private, rarely observed with ceremony. The emphasis was on collective identity, not personal milestones. Thus, when the Japanese women received cards acknowledging their individual birthdays, it struck them as deeply foreign. It wasn't just kindness. It was recognition of individuality, something suppressed by years of imperial ideology. In Japan, they had been taught that the self existed only in service to the emperor. The American gesture, small as it was, affirmed something radical, that they existed as individuals, worthy of remembrance even in defeat. That realization triggered a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude, confusion, guilt. Some prisoners hid the cards under their mattresses, fearing that others might see and accuse them of weakness. Others kept them folded in their uniforms like relics of a forbidden truth, that the enemy had treated them with dignity. One nurse, years later, wrote in her diary after repatriation, "The Americans gave us food, medicine, and kindness, but their greatest gift was that they saw me, not as a soldier, not as an enemy, but as a person. That frightened me more than any weapon." This psychological reversal was profound. The same women who had once believed dying for the emperor was noble now found themselves indebted to men who had spared them. It forced an internal reckoning. What did loyalty mean when mercy came from the enemy? From the American perspective, the cultural shock worked both ways. Many of the young GIs who guarded the camps had lost friends at Leyte or Okinawa. They carried anger they could barely control. But when they looked at these women, starving, sick, and unarmed, the hatred faltered. They began to see in them echoes of their own sisters, wives, and mothers waiting back home. One corporal later described it simply: "You spend years thinking the enemy's a monster. Then you hand her a bowl of rice, and she bows and says thank you. You realize how much of your hate was built on lies." That quiet revelation rippled through the ranks. The war had dehumanized both sides, but in captivity, humanity returned in fragments. The birthday cards became a symbol, not of forgiveness, but of recognition. As months passed, the mood within the camp subtly changed. The Japanese women began to speak more openly, exchanging broken English phrases with the guards. They learned names, asked questions, even laughed at small jokes. Trust was fragile, but real. When American officers arranged for music to be played over a camp loudspeaker, Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade, some of the prisoners cried. It wasn't the song itself. It was the sound of normalcy, something they had forgotten existed. The cross-cultural gap began to close, not through politics or orders, but through shared humanity. Yet beneath that fragile peace lay the unspoken awareness that these women would soon be sent home to a Japan that might not welcome them. Many feared they would be shunned, branded as traitors for having lived when others had died. For now, though, they clung to the small, impossible reality of their daily lives. The quiet rhythm of the camp, the rare gestures of kindness, the card folded carefully in their hands. That fragile calm, however, would not last forever. Outside the wire, new policies were forming, and the tide of post-war justice was rising fast. Tribunals, repatriations, and shifting alliances were about to redefine what mercy and accountability meant. And soon, both the prisoners and their American captors would be forced to confront a harsher truth: that humanity, once rediscovered, can be just as difficult to carry as hatred. The uneasy peace that settled over the camp was not simply the product of chance. It was the result of leadership, both visible and invisible, shaping how mercy would coexist with memory. On the American side, command decisions came from men who understood that the war's moral legacy would last longer than the smoke over Tokyo. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing occupation policy from his headquarters, insisted that Japanese prisoners be treated in accordance with civilized standards. It was as much a political statement as a moral one. MacArthur knew that victory could not rely solely on punishment. To rebuild Japan, America needed to transform it, not just physically, but spiritually. Every act of discipline, every regulation on POW conduct, was a step in that transformation. The treatment of captured Japanese personnel, especially women, became part of that vision. Their well-being reflected not only American magnanimity, but the ideological contrast between democracy and militarism. Down in the camps, this philosophy filtered through layers of officers and NCOs who translated orders into human interaction. Captain Harold Baines, the officer in charge of the Santo Tomas facility, was a career administrator, not a combat soldier. He had seen the ruins of Manila, the burned homes, the starving civilians. To him, cruelty seemed pointless. His reports to headquarters were clinical but revealing. Japanese female internees remained compliant. No disciplinary issues noted. Recommend continued humane treatment. Will ease repatriation morale. Baines's tone was detached, but his decisions were not. He allowed medical supplies to be distributed generously, and he discouraged displays of hostility from guards. It was not kindness alone. It was strategy. Peace required dignity. On the Japanese side, leadership looked very different. Within the camp, a quiet hierarchy persisted among the prisoners. Senior nurses, often older women with military experience in China or Burma, took on the role of moral guardians. They insisted on order, discipline, and ritual bows at sunrise and sunset. Even in captivity, they clung to the structure that had defined their service. To them, losing order meant losing the last remnants of identity. One of these women, Sergeant Major Nakahara Yuki, had served under the Imperial Army's medical division since 1939. Her authority was unquestioned. She walked with the rigid posture of someone who had spent years saluting portraits of the emperor. In the first weeks of captivity, She forbade her subordinates from speaking with the Americans except when ordered. But over time, even she began to waver. She watched as the guards shared cigarettes, as the nurses exchanged polite words of gratitude, and she felt something she had not felt since before the war: confusion. Her faith in Japan's infallibility had already been shaken by surrender. Now it was being quietly eroded by kindness. One day, she was handed a card with her own name on it, a birthday she had not celebrated in years. She held it for hours, studying the foreign letters, unable to decide whether it was an insult or a miracle. That night, she gathered the women under her care and told them softly, "Perhaps the enemy we feared does not exist." From that moment, authority in the camp no longer came from fear, but from understanding. The power dynamics shifted, subtly but irreversibly. American leadership relied on structure. Japanese leadership began to rediscover empathy. Between them, a fragile equilibrium formed, a bridge made not of treaties, but of gestures. Meanwhile, beyond the camp walls, the wider enemy perspective began to change. Reports of humane treatment filtered back to Japan through Red Cross correspondence and later through returning prisoners. At first, many in Japan refused to believe them. Wartime propaganda had been so absolute that even mercy seemed impossible. Newspapers published government-issued statements warning citizens not to be deceived by enemy deception tactics. But word spread quietly among families of the captured. The Americans were not killing their prisoners. They were feeding them, healing them, even writing to them. This information began to erode decades of indoctrination. For civilians who had spent years fearing invasion, it complicated their hatred. Could an enemy capable of compassion truly be the monster their leaders had described? In small ways, the psychological groundwork for post-war reconciliation was being laid, not through negotiation, but through individual acts of decency. When the first repatriated nurses returned to Japan in late 1946, they carried stories that sounded like heresy. They described fair treatment, medical aid, and even the strange custom of birthday cards. Some were accused of lying, others were met with quiet disbelief. A few were ostracized entirely, seen as tainted by contact with the enemy. Yet, their testimonies would later become part of Japan's post-war memory, a hidden thread in the complex tapestry of surrender, shame, and rebirth. For the Americans, too, the moral reckoning was profound. In the years that followed, as photographs of liberated POWs and civilian camps reached the public, the narrative of the good war evolved. The same soldiers who had once been consumed by vengeance found themselves reflecting on the consequences of mercy. Psychologists within the U.S. Army recorded that humane treatment of prisoners had a measurable effect on the mental stability of guards. Acts of empathy, they found, lessened trauma. The cards, though never officially recorded in policy, became a quiet lesson in post-war military ethics. The idea that compassion could be a weapon of stability, something stronger than fear, was revolutionary for men trained to kill. The war had taught them to destroy. Peace demanded they learn to care. And beneath all this lay the moral angle, the most enduring, the most difficult to define. The act of sending a birthday card to an enemy prisoner seems trivial in the grand architecture of war. Yet its moral weight lies precisely in its simplicity. It required no orders, no diplomacy, no signatures. Only the decision of one human being to recognize another's existence. In that single gesture, centuries of martial philosophy collided. The Japanese code of Bushidō demanded loyalty unto death. The American ethos of democracy prized the individual's worth. Between them, a single folded card carried the essence of both and the contradiction of each. For the Japanese women, the card was both blessing and curse. It reminded them that their enemies saw them as human, but it also forced them to confront how their own system had denied that same humanity to others. For the Americans, the act offered redemption, a small atonement for the horror of the Pacific campaigns. Years later, historians would point to these POW camps as microcosms of a larger transformation, the moment when two civilizations, having destroyed each other's illusions, began to see their shared fragility. The battlefield had been replaced by barbed wire, but the struggle for the human soul continued. When the time came for repatriation, the women lined up one final time at the camp gate. American officers handed them papers, small bags of belongings, and transport instructions. Some bowed deeply, others turned away to hide tears. Among their few possessions were folded letters and cards, tokens of a kindness that had rewritten their understanding of victory and defeat. One by one, they boarded trucks heading toward the harbor, their faces unreadable. The Americans saluted them, not as enemies, but as survivors. It was an image that defied the brutality of the years that preceded it. And as those trucks disappeared into the distance, carrying the remnants of an empire toward a homeland that would never be the same, the guards left behind were left with an equally haunting realization. In the end, it wasn't weapons or orders that bridged the abyss between enemies. It was recognition. That recognition would soon be tested as the machinery of post-war justice began to turn, and questions of guilt and forgiveness rose once more to the surface. The repatriation order came in the spring of 1946. The war had been over for months, yet the shadow of it lingered in every command, every letter, every silence. Across the Pacific, American officers began organizing the transport of tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners back to their homeland. Ships were being prepared in Manila Bay, their decks cleaned, their flags repainted for peace. Inside the Santo Tomas compound, the announcement spread like wildfire. "You will be sent home." For many of the Japanese nurses, the words were almost incomprehensible. Home had become an idea, not a place, a fragment of memory carried through the noise of defeat. Some wept openly. Others stood motionless, unable to imagine what awaited them beyond the ocean. The Americans, too, were uneasy. For a year they had guarded these women, watched them recover from malnutrition and illness, seen them celebrate birthdays, mourn lost comrades, and rebuild fragments of dignity. Now they were to let them go, send them back to the very nation that once vowed to annihilate them. It was a strange, humbling kind of victory. In the final days before departure, tensions in the camp rose unexpectedly. The calm that had characterized the months of coexistence gave way to nervous energy. Some of the younger American guards, veterans of brutal fighting in the Philippines or Okinawa, found their buried memories resurfacing. They remembered comrades killed in jungle ambushes, faces burned by napalm, men mutilated in Japanese camps. And now they were expected to smile, shake hands, and send their former enemies home with courtesy. One night, an argument broke out near the perimeter fence. A young American private, barely 20, confronted an older Japanese nurse over a perceived infraction, something trivial, perhaps a curfew violation. His voice shook with anger. "You people killed my brother." He spat, his rifle trembling in his grip. For a moment, the fragile peace threatened to shatter. But before anything could happen, another guard, a sergeant named Walter Keene, stepped forward. Keene had fought in Leyte, had seen the worst of it. He placed a hand on the rifle and said quietly, "The war's over, son. Let it stay that way." The younger man hesitated, eyes wet with rage, then lowered his weapon. The nurse bowed deeply, whispering something in Japanese that no one understood. Keen only nodded and walked away. That small, silent moment, the restraint, the choice not to reopen wounds, became the invisible climax of the entire story. It was not recorded in reports or remembered in official histories, but it embodied the deeper transformation taking place. The realization that peace required more courage than war ever had. A few days later, the farewell ceremony began. The American command insisted on formal dignity. A makeshift flagpole had been erected near the gate, and both nations' flags were raised in the morning sun, the stars and stripes beside the red circle of Japan. The wind caught them, and for the first time in years, they fluttered side by side. The women stood in orderly rows, dressed in faded uniforms that no longer bore insignia. Their faces were drawn, but calm. Some clutched small bundles of possessions, handkerchiefs, photographs, pieces of cloth. A few carried letters and cards given to them by the guards. Among them was Sergeant Major Nakahara Yuki. Her posture was still straight, but her eyes, once sharp and unyielding, had softened. When her name was called, she stepped forward. An American officer handed her repatriation papers and saluted. Without hesitation, she returned the salute. For a second, two opposing worlds existed in perfect symmetry. The conqueror and the conquered acknowledging each other's humanity. Cameras captured the moment, though few would ever see the photographs. As the ceremony ended, an unexpected event occurred. One of the nurses, barely 21 years old, approached the podium. She carried a small folded paper in her hand, a birthday card she had received from one of the guards. She bowed and placed it gently on the wooden platform. "For your kindness," she said in broken English. The officer on duty, unsure how to respond, simply nodded. The gesture spread like a spark. Others began leaving small tokens: hand-sewn handkerchiefs, origami cranes, scraps of fabric embroidered with names. It was not planned, not ordered. It was gratitude made visible, a wordless reconciliation. That night, the Americans gathered in the mess hall for what would be their final briefing before the prisoners' departure. There was little talk of policy or procedure. Most of the men sat in silence, nursing coffee, staring at the wooden floor. Captain Baines, who had overseen the camp since the end of the war, finally spoke. "You did your duty," he said quietly. "But maybe duty isn't just what we owe our country. Maybe it's what we owe ourselves after what we've seen." No one replied. They didn't need to. Outside, the night air was still, the camp eerily quiet. In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of the women singing, a soft, rhythmic chant that carried across the compound like a farewell prayer. At dawn, the convoy began. Trucks lined up at the gates, engines rumbling. The guards stood at attention as the prisoners boarded. Some exchanged final glances, others bowed silently. A few Americans raised their hands in subtle waves, gestures half hidden behind their rifles. It was awkward, almost painful, as if saying goodbye to a part of themselves they no longer recognized. As the trucks rolled away, dust rising in their wake, Sergeant Keene turned to a fellow guard and muttered, "Guess it's over." The other man, staring into the horizon, replied, "Or maybe it's just beginning." Hours later, at Manila Bay, the Japanese women were escorted aboard transport ships bound for Yokohama. They lined the railings as the ships pulled away, watching the coastline recede into a blur of gray and gold. The ocean stretched before them, an uncertain passage between memory and rebirth. On the deck, Yuki stood beside a young nurse who clutched her card tightly. The younger woman asked softly, "Do you think they meant it? The words they wrote?" Yuki looked at the horizon, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes," she said, "and that is what makes it so heavy." Back in the camp, the Americans began dismantling the barracks. Within weeks, Santo Tomas would be handed back to civilian authorities. The letters, the cards, the small exchanges of humanity, all would fade into the background of post-war reconstruction. But for those who lived it, the memory would remain, buried beneath layers of silence and shame. What none of them knew then was that a few of those cards would survive. Kept in boxes, passed down to families, resurfacing decades later in museums and archives. Each one bore the handwriting of an American soldier and the name of a Japanese nurse, reminders that compassion, once given, can outlive even the longest wars. And yet, even as the ships crossed the Pacific, another kind of war was beginning. The battle for memory, for how this story would be told and who would be allowed to remember it. For days, the ships crossed a calm but endless sea. The Pacific, once a graveyard of fleets, lay still beneath a sky washed clean by rain. The women spent their time on deck, staring into the distance, trying to picture the homeland they had left behind. For some, Japan was still the nation of their youth, strong, proud, and invincible. For others, it had become a memory wrapped in ashes and regret. Each night, the crew handed out food and supplies. The American officers aboard treated the returning nurses with the same measured courtesy that had become the unspoken rule since the surrender. There were no insults, no arrogance, only an uneasy quiet born of mutual exhaustion. On the third night, a small group of Japanese women gathered in the corner of the deck, their hair tied back with worn ribbons. One of them began humming a lullaby from home, a song once sung in field hospitals to calm the wounded. Others joined in, their voices trembling but steady. The melody drifted across the ship, mixing with the sound of waves. A few American sailors paused their duties, listening from a distance. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the meaning. It was a sound the ocean hadn't heard in years, a song not of victory or defeat, but of survival. When the ship finally reached Yokohama, the harbor was unrecognizable. The once bustling docks were now skeletal remains, the cranes twisted, warehouses burned out. Beyond the shoreline, the city stretched in ruins. Gray, silent, motionless. The nurses stepped ashore to find their homeland in pieces. American occupation troops were everywhere. Signs written in both English and Japanese hung from government buildings. Allied flags fluttered above offices where imperial banners once waved. It was a new world, and for many of the returning prisoners, it felt colder than captivity. At a processing center near the harbor, Japanese officials recorded their names and medical conditions. Some were questioned about their service, others about what they had seen in the camps. The returning women quickly realized that their experiences were not to be celebrated. Instead, they were met with suspicion. Some male officers regarded them as tainted by surrender, contaminated by proximity to the enemy. The silence of defeat had replaced the screams of war. Among them, Nakahara Yuki stood apart. Her rank meant little now. The army she had served was gone. When asked about her time in American custody, she replied simply, "We were treated as human beings." The clerk taking notes frowned and said nothing. That single sentence would never appear in any official report. In the weeks that followed, life for these women became a quiet struggle for identity. Many returned to towns that no longer existed. Families had been lost to bombings or starvation. The country was in ruins, its people clinging to survival. In that chaos, the memories of the birthday cards, the kindness, the strange glimpses of humanity across enemy lines, those memories began to feel unreal, like something that could not possibly have happened in the same war. And yet, they could not forget. Some kept their cards hidden among personal belongings, reading them in secret when the nights felt too long. Others destroyed them out of fear of being misunderstood. But a few, just a few, held on, knowing they were part of something larger than orders or nations. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the Americans who had served as guards tried to return to ordinary life. Many failed. The quiet after war felt unbearable. Some re-enlisted, unable to find purpose in peace. Others tried to bury their memories, though certain images refused to fade. The sound of Japanese nurses singing, the look in their eyes when they received those simple cards, the realization that mercy had changed them more than victory ever could. In 1947, one of the former guards, Sergeant Walter Keene, wrote a letter to a local newspaper. He described the experience in plain terms. "We treated them kindly because it was the right thing to do. I thought I'd forget it after I came home, but I didn't. That war took everything out of us, and somehow giving them back a little dignity gave some back to me too." The letter was never widely published, but copies circulated among veterans groups. Some agreed with him, others called it weakness. But over time, those few who had witnessed the small reconciliations inside the POW camps began to see them as the true turning points. Not the battles, not the surrenders, but the moments when men and women who had every reason to hate chose not to. By the early 1950s, the world had moved on. Japan was rebuilding, the United States was fighting a new war in Korea, and memories of the Pacific had begun to fade from public consciousness. But inside museums, archives, and personal collections, traces of that hidden humanity remained. In 1952, a historian working for the International Red Cross stumbled upon a series of correspondences in the organization's Geneva archive. Letters from American officers detailing the humane treatment of Japanese prisoners in the Philippines, including the peculiar mention of birthday gestures. It was a small discovery, but it offered a window into a forgotten dimension of war. The historian wrote in his report, "Perhaps the most remarkable victory of the Second World War was not one of armies, but of conscience." Back in Japan, some of the surviving nurses lived quiet, unassuming lives. They worked in hospitals, raised families, and rarely spoke of the war. Yet occasionally, during anniversaries or reunions, fragments of those memories resurfaced. A woman might pull a faded card from a drawer, its edges yellowed, the English words barely legible. "Happy birthday." Beneath it, a simple handwritten message, "Wishing you peace." To them, it was not just a card. It was proof that even in the darkest years of human history, there had been light. For the younger generation of Japanese who came of age in the 1960s, the war was a story told in textbooks, not in memories. Few knew of the nurses who had been prisoners, or of the Americans who had treated them with dignity. The subject was uncomfortable for both nations, a reminder of wounds that never fully healed. But as time passed, those who had lived it began to speak. In interviews, memoirs, and oral histories, fragments of the truth emerged. One former nurse, interviewed in 1975, said quietly to the historian recording her, "When they sent us those cards, I realized we had been wrong. Not about fighting, but about what it meant to be human." It was a statement so simple, yet so devastating. In her words lay the essence of the turning point. the realization that humanity could outlast ideology. By the end of the century, the few remaining survivors of Santo Tomas were old. Their memories had grown soft around the edges, blurred by time. Yet one object remained vivid in every retelling. A folded card, creased by decades of handling, marked with the handwriting of a young American guard who once decided that an enemy deserved to be remembered on her birthday. That small, fragile gesture became the invisible climax of their lives. For the soldiers, it had been an act of healing. For the prisoners, an awakening. For history, a quiet truth whispered beneath the roar of nations. And though the war had ended long ago, the moral battle it revealed, the fight to remember compassion amid destruction, was one humanity would continue to wage. It was that legacy, not the ruins or the medals, that defined the real turning point of the Pacific War. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, the Pacific Ocean became less a battlefield and more a bridge. Cargo ships replaced warships, and the air once filled with the echo of engines now carried the sound of rebuilding. Yet for those who had lived through the captivity, the guards and the nurses, the war never truly ended. It lived inside them, not as trauma alone, but as a question. What had it all meant? For the Japanese women who returned home, life settled into patterns of endurance. Some resumed nursing in hospitals under the new American-led administration. Others married, raised children, and blended into the quiet rhythm of post-war survival. But each carried a private memory of captivity that rarely found words. They remembered the hunger, the fear, and the humiliation. Yet alongside it, they also remembered something unexpected, the kindness of men who had every reason to despise them. Japan itself was changing rapidly. By the early 1950s, under MacArthur's reforms, the nation had rebuilt its economy and rewritten its identity. Militarism was outlawed. Democracy, education, and women's rights began to take root. But collective memory lagged behind. For most Japanese citizens, the war's moral complexity was something better left unspoken. To speak of the past risked shame. To speak of compassion risked misunderstanding. It was in this silence that the story of the birthday cards began to fade. The women who had received them rarely shared the details. Some feared being accused of sympathy for the occupiers. Others believed the world would not care. And yet, across the ocean, small traces of the story were being quietly preserved. In the archives of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, a few handwritten reports mentioned humanitarian exchanges with female Japanese prisoners. One officer described the atmosphere at Santo Tomas as a model of controlled compassion. Another report, dated September 1946, noted, interactions between guards and prisoners yielded unexpectedly positive psychological outcomes. Mutual respect observed. These were sterile words on government paper, but they hinted at something deeper, a recognition that even in victory, humanity mattered. In 1948, during the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, prosecutors presented evidence of Japanese atrocities against Allied POWs. The photographs, testimonies, and medical reports horrified the world. Yet buried within the documentation, a handful of defense lawyers introduced statements about the humane treatment of Japanese prisoners under American custody. They were not meant as deflection, but as context. There were moments, one lawyer said, when mercy survived the war. The courtroom was silent. No one applauded. The world was not ready to reconcile compassion with conflict. Meanwhile, on the personal level, the aftermath was more intimate. Sergeant Walter Keene returned to his hometown in Illinois, where he worked as a postal clerk. Every year, On the anniversary of Japan's surrender, he would take out a small envelope containing a letter he never sent. It was addressed to Miss Yuki Nakahara, Tokyo, though he had no idea if she was alive. The letter read simply, "I don't know if you remember me. I hope you made it home. I hope you're well. You once told me that mercy was heavy. You were right. It never leaves." The letter stayed with him until his death in 1971. When his daughter found it among his belongings, she didn't understand its meaning. Decades later, it would be donated to a museum, alongside his military photographs and the words Santo Tomas written in pencil on the back of one. For the women, the decades after the war were equally marked by silence. Nakahara Yuki settled in Osaka, working as a midwife until retirement. Her colleagues knew little of her past, only that she refused to speak ill of Americans. "They treated me as a person," she would sometimes say, and nothing more. When she died in 1983, her belongings revealed a single preserved card, yellowed, folded, its corners frayed. On the back, in fading English, were the words, "Happy birthday, Sergeant Major Yuki, from your friends in the guard detail." The card became a family heirloom, a relic of an impossible friendship. By the late 1980s, historians began revisiting the human dimensions of World War II, beyond strategy and weaponry. Oral history projects surfaced in both Japan and the United States. Veterans and survivors, now in their 70s, began to speak with a new honesty about what they had seen. Among those stories, one recurring theme appeared: compassion amid captivity. The accounts varied. Some described guards who shared food, others who protected prisoners from cruelty. But they all pointed to the same truth. The war had not destroyed humanity entirely. It had simply buried it beneath orders. One interview conducted in 1988 with a former American corporal revealed a direct connection to Santo Tomas. He recalled, "We had this idea to send birthday cards to the women. It wasn't official, just something we thought might make them feel like people again. We didn't expect anything in return. But when they left, some of them gave us these tiny embroidered cranes. I kept mine." He paused, his voice trembling, before adding, "Sometimes I think that was the only good thing I did in the war." By the dawn of the 21st century, those few remaining artifacts, letters, cranes, photographs, became subjects of exhibitions and documentaries. Historians pieced together the fragments, reconstructing a story long overshadowed by grander narratives of strategy and destruction. In Tokyo, one museum dedicated a small glass case to Unlikely Acts of Humanity, 1945-1946. Inside it rested one of the birthday cards. Visitors rarely noticed it among the medals and weapons, but those who did often lingered in silence. For Americans, too, the memory carried weight. The narrative of the good war had long been part of national identity, yet stories like this complicated that image. They suggested that the greatest moral victory had not been military, but personal, the triumph of empathy over vengeance. The psychological aftermath was profound. Studies conducted on post-war veterans revealed that those who had treated prisoners humanely often reported lower rates of depression and guilt. The act of mercy had been its own therapy. For the Japanese women, those memories became a source of quiet strength, a private counterweight to the national shame of defeat. Yet even in this reconciliation, an unease persisted. The world moved forward, nations rebuilt, and new conflicts arose. The moral lessons of the past were often overshadowed by the next crisis. But somewhere between Tokyo and Washington, in the archives of forgotten correspondence, the story of the birthday cards remained, a whisper of what humanity can become when the guns fall silent. It was an aftermath not marked by treaties or speeches, but by remembrance. And as both nations stepped into a new century of prosperity, the faint echo of those gestures continued to haunt the margins of history. A quiet reminder that the greatest victories are sometimes invisible. And still, for the families who inherited those fragile relics, the story was not over. The next generation would discover the meaning behind them, unaware that they were touching a thread that once connected two enemies across an ocean. In the early 2000s, Japan was a nation at peace, but still shadowed by memory. Its cities glittered with modern glass towers, its people spoke of progress and technology. Yet, beneath the surface, history remained an unspoken wound. In schools, the war was mentioned briefly, dates, battles, outcomes, but rarely the emotional aftermath. Few textbooks spoke of the nurses who had served and suffered. Fewer still spoke of the Americans who treated them as equals in defeat. Then, in 2003, a discovery reignited the forgotten story. In a small museum in Kyoto dedicated to wartime nursing, an archivist sorting through personal donations found a faded envelope inside an old uniform pocket. Inside was a birthday card, simple, yellowed, written in English. It read, "Wishing you strength and peace on your birthday, from your American friends, 1946. The name at the bottom was unmistakable, Yuki In. The archivist, uncertain of its significance, began researching. What emerged was a chain of testimonies stretching back half a century. A network of letters, diaries, and interviews connecting the forgotten nurses of Santo Tomas to the American guards who once watched over them. The museum launched a small exhibit titled Mercy After War. It was not large, but it drew attention. Elderly visitors lingered in front of the card's glass display, some whispering prayers, others silently weeping. News of the exhibit reached the United States through a cultural exchange program. A journalist from California, researching post-war reconciliation, visited Kyoto and wrote an article about the card. His piece, titled "The Birthday Letters, Humanity Between Enemies," was published in 2004 in a small historical magazine. The response was overwhelming. Veterans associations, historians, and descendants of former POWs reached out, many claiming to have heard similar stories from their fathers or grandfathers. Among the letters received by the magazine was one from a woman in Illinois. Susan Keene, daughter of Sergeant Walter Keene. She wrote, "My father used to tell us there was one good thing he did in the war. He never explained what it was. After reading your article, I think I finally understand." Susan flew to Japan that autumn. The Kyoto Museum arranged a quiet ceremony in her father's honor. She stood before the display case, tears gathering in her eyes, as a translator read aloud the words on the card her father had once written. Nearby, Japanese visitors bowed deeply, a gesture of shared respect that transcended language. It was the first time the descendants of both sides had met face to face over that fragile piece of paper. Cameras flashed, but the moment itself was still, almost sacred. The curator later said, "It felt like the war ended again, just for a second." In the years that followed, other artifacts began to surface. In 2006, a trunk belonging to another former nurse was found in a family home near Fukuoka. Inside were 2 birthday cards, carefully wrapped in cloth, along with a note written decades earlier. "These were given to us by the Americans. They taught me that kindness can exist even in defeat." Historians began connecting the stories, piecing together the fragments of a forgotten chapter of the Pacific War. The narrative that emerged was not about generals or battles, but about ordinary people, soldiers and nurses, who found humanity in the ruins. Documentaries soon followed. One, produced by a Japanese-American collaboration in 2009, was titled "The War That Ended with a Birthday Card." It combined archival footage, survivor interviews, and dramatized reenactments. The closing scene showed an elderly Japanese woman holding a faded card beneath soft morning light, her trembling voice whispering, "They saw us as people." The film won several awards, not for spectacle, but for silence, for showing that reconciliation could be tender, not triumphant. As more people learned of the story, its meaning began to shift. What had once been an anecdote became a moral lesson. Schools in Japan began using the tale in ethics and history classes, not as propaganda, but as reflection. Teachers asked students, "What would you do if your enemy offered you kindness?" In the United States, the story entered discussions about post-war ethics, the Geneva Conventions, and the psychology of mercy. Scholars argued that acts like the birthday cards represented a turning point in military conduct, an early expression of what would later be codified as humanitarian treatment of prisoners. But beyond academia, the emotional resonance was far greater. Veterans who had long carried guilt or bitterness found in the story a kind of release. Some wrote to Japanese museums, thanking them for keeping the memory alive. Others visited Japan, retracing the paths of their fathers and grandfathers. In 2010, one of those visitors was a retired U.S. Army medic named Robert Dawson, the son of a Santo Tomas guard. He brought with him a folded paper crane that his father had kept since 1946. Standing in front of the Kyoto Museum exhibit, he placed the crane beside the original birthday card and whispered, "Dad, I brought it home." A journalist covering the event later wrote, "There were no victors in that moment, only inheritors of mercy." By the mid-2010s, the story had taken on new relevance in an age still defined by conflict. Politicians and peace activists invoked it as an example of what humanity could achieve even after destruction. Universities held lectures titled "The Morality of Mercy: Lessons from the Pacific War." The tale spread online, reaching younger generations who saw it not as a history lesson, but as a human one. Yet for the few surviving women who had actually lived it, the rediscovery brought bittersweet feelings. One of them, aged 93, gave an interview from her nursing home outside Hiroshima. Her voice was frail, but her memory clear. "I remember their faces," she said of the Americans. "They were tired like us. They smiled when they handed me the card. I didn't understand the words then, but I understood their hearts." When asked what she did with the card, she smiled faintly. "I still have it. I keep it under my pillow. It reminds me that kindness can be stronger than war." Her words circulated online, shared millions of times across social media. In a world once again divided by fear and nationalism, her quiet testimony became an echo from the past. A reminder that the simplest human acts can outlive empires. In 2020, the Kyoto Museum held a final commemorative exhibition marking 75 years since the end of the war. The centerpiece remained that same faded birthday card, now displayed beside photographs of both the Japanese nurses and their American guards. Beneath it, a new inscription was added. "Between victory and defeat lies humanity." Visitors came from across the world. Some brought flowers. Others wrote letters addressed to no one in particular, just to say thank you. For many, it was not about forgiveness or history. It was about recognition that in the rubble of hatred, something fragile yet eternal had survived. And as the last of the witnesses passed away, the objects they left behind, the cards, the cranes, the photographs, became sacred relics of peace. Proof that even when nations forget, humanity remembers. Because mercy, once given, does not vanish. It ripples quietly through generations, changing the shape of memory itself. And though the Pacific now lies calm beneath the sun, the invisible waves of that mercy still move across it, linking the hearts of those who once stood on opposite shores, bound not by blood or duty, but by the simple courage to be kind. In war, history remembers the victors. It builds monuments to generals, carves names into granite, and fills books with the movements of armies. But history rarely pauses for moments like this, moments of quiet mercy that ask for no reward, no recognition. Yet these are the moments that define what it means to be human. The birthday cards sent to the Japanese prisoners were never part of any official program, never mentioned in command reports or victory speeches. They were small acts of conscience, written by ordinary men who had seen enough death to know the value of life. Against the noise of vengeance, they whispered something different, something revolutionary for its simplicity: compassion. For the women who received them, those cards did more than mark the passing of another year. They reopened the possibility of trust. They reminded them that beneath the flags and uniforms, humanity still existed, fragile yet undefeated. That realization changed them more profoundly than any political surrender could. Time has turned those cards into artifacts, their ink fading with the decades. But their meaning has not faded. Each one stands as a quiet testimony that even in humanity's darkest hours, decency can endure. Not because it is easy, but because someone chooses it. When we look back on the Second World War, we see numbers: millions dead, nations in ruins. But hidden between those numbers are moments like this. Letters written by tired soldiers, given to frightened nurses, carrying nothing but kindness. They remind us that peace is not declared on a stage or signed at a table. It begins in small gestures, carried by hands that once held weapons and hearts that decide to do no harm. The war ended long ago, but its echoes still shape us. And somewhere, perhaps in a drawer or a museum case, a yellowed birthday card continues to outlast the noise of history. A fragile paper bridge between enemies who, for one brief and beautiful moment, remembered they were human.